Okay, so today's history hit comes to us from the middle 1850s, the years leading up to the Civil War and during the Civil War and after the Civil War as well, because our subject for today's history hit was born in 1820, thereabouts, no real birth records, and didn't die until 1913, one of the most famous women in American history. And her name is Araminta Ross. And you're saying to yourself, I have never heard of Araminta Ross. And it's not true. You have. You just don't know her by that name. She was born a slave in the eastern shore of Maryland sometime in the early 1820s. There have been several dates given for her birth. She was injured as a young child, and it gave her fainting spells all throughout her life. You're probably thinking by this point that you know who this is, but stay with me. Anyway, so she had got married in the 1840s to a free black man. In the late 1840s, she decided that she could no longer live as a slave. That's right, her husband was free. She was a slave. This is apparently not terribly uncommon in the Maryland Eastern Shore. Remember, Maryland's a slave state. It's fairly far north even of Washington, D.C., which was the capital of the Union. But it's a slave state nonetheless. It's south of the Mason-Dixon line, which of course is the parallel that runs between the Maryland and Pennsylvania. So she escaped to Pennsylvania and describes the experience of crossing into the free state of Pennsylvania as like entering into paradise. She says that she looked at her hands to see if she was the same person. If you've never gone from an area of great slavery is not too strong a word, to a free area, you probably don't know the feeling that I'm talking about. But having gone myself from communist Eastern Europe into Western Europe several times back in the middle 1980s, it's a feeling that I'm not unfamiliar with, not to the same degree that she was, but certainly it's a real thing. All of a sudden, it's sort of like coming from the black and white of Dorothy's experience in Kansas to the green and yellow and gold and the beauty of the color of Oz. It's not too much different than that. Anyway, so she escaped to Pennsylvania, but after a little while realized that she couldn't rest, and that the only thing that she really wanted to do with her life was to help escaped slaves to become free. So Ms. Ross, by now a woman named Harriet Tubman, she married a man named Tubman, took his married name, and then changed her name to Harriet for reasons which we don't know, started making raids into the South, into the eastern shore of Maryland, the area that she was the most familiar with along the Choptank River, and bringing slaves to the North. The problem was that in 1850, the federal government passed a law called the Fugitive Slave Act, which I personally consider to be the worst law that's ever been passed in American history. And there is a long list, and that is a very high bar to get over. Nevertheless, I think it's the worst one ever. What it meant was that even escaped slaves who reached free territory in the North had to be returned to their slave owners. Now, this is one of the most violated laws in American history. Nevertheless, it did make it dangerous for escaped slaves to stay in the northern United States, even in territories where there were free blacks and where slavery was outlawed. So these escaped slaves would have to go all the way to Canada, and there was a thriving population of escaped slaves in Canada that Harriet Tubman was able to smuggle a bunch of her escaped slaves to. She made 19 raids, liberated about 75 slaves, never once lost a single one. She was equipped mostly with just her native intelligence, her faith in God, and a pistol that she carried with her wherever she went. Reportedly, one time when one of the slaves threatened to go back, started feeling like this was a bad idea and he was going to end up being beaten or shot or hung or whatever it was, she put the gun to his head and said, "You go on or die." And he was with them when they crossed into Canada. She was an amazing woman who also was the first woman to lead an armed raid, the armed troops in combat during the Civil War in 1963. There's a raid. She and an American colonel, Colonel James Montgomery, staged a raid on the Combahee River and liberated about 750 slaves using a bunch of steamboats to evade Confederate mines that were placed in the harbor in South Carolina. An utterly amazing woman. She was a spy. She delivered intelligence that helped liberate Jacksonville, Florida, among many other things. When she got finished with her work as an abolitionist during the period of the Civil War and just afterward, she became a crusader for women's suffrage and worked with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and other women of that era in trying to get women the vote. A truly astonishing woman and an American hero. As so many times happens, she died penniless, although not alone. She was surrounded by friends and family and has become one of the most celebrated women in American history, certainly one of the top 5 civilian figures in all of American history, and she deserves every bit of the praise that she gets. That's today's History Hit on Harriet Tubman, one of my personal heroes. See you next time.